It began like a whisper from the stones. In the darkness before dawn, Jerusalem held its breath. The ancient city, cradled between valleys and hills, had witnessed empires rise and fall, prophets walk its narrow streets, and prayers ascend from its sacred spaces for thousands of years. But what happened at precisely 3:33 a.m. on that cool spring morning was something altogether different. Even the wind between the domes fell silent. Rachel Solomon, a lifelong resident of the old city, was standing near the western wall when she first felt it. A strange vibration beneath her feet, as if the very foundation of the earth was stirring from slumber. She had come early, as she often did, seeking the quiet intimacy of prayer before the crowds arrived. But tonight, something had pulled her from sleep with unusual urgency. "Ma, I've lived in Jerusalem all my life," she would later tell reporters, her voice trembling slightly. "I've felt earthquakes before. This was different. It was as if the city itself was breathing." The sky above Jerusalem remained dark, but the stars seemed to pulse with unusual intensity. Rachel wasn't the only one who had been drawn outside at this strange hour. Across the city, hundreds reported being awakened by an inexplicable sensation, a calling that had pulled them from their beds. A group of tourists from South America had gathered at a viewpoint on the Mount of Olives, cameras ready for sunrise photos. Instead, they became witnesses to something extraordinary. Paulo Herrera, a Brazilian pastor, described it later with tears in his eyes. "We felt compelled to climb the mount before dawn. None of us knew why. Then the ground began to tremble, and we all fell silent. From the Mount of Olives to the old city gates, silence spread. In that moment of stillness, the first light appeared, not from the east where the sun would eventually rise, but from the Temple Mount itself, a soft golden glow that seemed to emanate not from any physical source, but from within the ancient stones. What mainstream media later called a rare atmospheric phenomenon, those present experienced as something far more profound. The light shimmered over the domes like liquid gold, spreading upward into the night sky. David Klein, an Israeli geologist who had been monitoring seismic activity in the region, would later struggle to explain the readings from his equipment. There was movement, he admitted, but nothing that should have been perceptible to humans. Yet hundreds felt it simultaneously across the city. The prophet Zechariah had written of a day when the Mount of Olives would split in two, from east to west. For centuries, scholars had debated the meaning of this prophecy. Was it metaphorical or literal? Was it describing a past event or one yet to come? As the golden light spread across the pre-dawn sky, an elderly rabbi standing at the western wall whispered the words of the prophet, "On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west." The vibration beneath the city intensified, not violent like an earthquake, but purposeful, like a heartbeat. In those early morning hours, as Jerusalem held its collective breath, something ancient was stirring, a convergence of prophecy and present moment that would forever change those who witnessed it. What happened next would shake not only Jerusalem, but reverberate across the world. Today, light appeared above the Temple Mount. By sunrise, the strange golden glow had faded, but Jerusalem was awakening to news spreading rapidly through the narrow streets of the old city, across social media, and into the international press. Something unprecedented had occurred during the night hours. The morning shimmered with unusual clarity. The golden light brushed the ancient stones of the city walls, and pilgrims from every faith tradition were already streaming toward the sacred sites, drawn by rumors and mysterious video clips circulating online. Shopkeepers stopped mid-sentence as another tremor, gentle but unmistakable, passed through the city. Dr. Sarah Cohen, lead archaeologist at a dig site near the southern wall of the Temple Mount, had been recording unusual instrument readings since 3:33 a.m. At first, "I thought our equipment was malfunctioning," she explained to her team as they gathered at the site. But then reports started coming in from across the city. The Israel Meteorological Service had registered what they termed anomalous seismic activity, centered precisely at the Mount of Olives. Yet despite the measurable ground movement, there had been no structural damage reported anywhere in the city, a fact that puzzled experts. "It's as if the earth is breathing," Dr. Cohen said, studying the continuous readings on her tablet. "Look at this pattern. It's almost rhythmic." By mid-morning, thousands had gathered at various points throughout Jerusalem. The Western Wall Plaza was filled beyond capacity. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre had to close its doors temporarily due to the crowds, and on the Mount of Olives itself, people stood shoulder to shoulder, many with their hands raised in prayer. A woman quoted from Acts, her voice trembling, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up toward heaven? This Jesus, who has been taken up from you into heaven, will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven." International news crews had arrived by noon, setting up cameras at strategic viewpoints across the city. Yet strangely, many reported technical difficulties, equipment malfunctioning, cameras capturing unexplainable light phenomena, audio recordings picking up what some described as harmonics beneath the ambient city sounds. Meanwhile, social media platforms were struggling to separate fact from fiction. Videos showing the golden light from the early morning hours were being analyzed by experts and dismissed by skeptics. Some clips appeared to show the actual ground on the Mount of Olives shifting slightly, while others captured unusual cloud formations above the city. Even those who hadn't witnessed the initial event at 3:33 a.m. could feel something different in Jerusalem that day. Tourists described an atmosphere of expectancy, a thickness in the air like the moments before a summer storm. Rabbi Eliezer ben David, a respected scholar of ancient texts, addressed a group gathered near the Mount of Olives. Zechariah's prophecy speaks of a physical splitting of this mountain, he explained. But perhaps what we're experiencing is the beginning, the first tremors of something that unfolds not in a single moment, but across time. As evening approached, Jerusalem prepared for another night. Hotels were fully booked as word continued to spread. Religious leaders from various traditions called for calm and contemplation, yet there was an undeniable sense that everyone was waiting, watching for what might happen next. The heat shimmered over the domes as the sun began its descent. Families gathered on rooftops, eyes fixed on the Mount of Olives, where small groups of people remained, some in prayer circles, others simply waiting in reverent silence. What was happening in Jerusalem? Was it merely an unusual geological event being imbued with spiritual significance by fervent believers? Or was it, as some claimed, the beginning of something foretold thousands of years ago? As darkness fell once more over the ancient city, those questions hung in the air like the lingering notes of a shofar's call. And somewhere, beneath the surface of ordinary perception, the trembling continued. I was standing near the Western Wall when I saw it. The second night arrived with an electric anticipation flowing through the streets of Jerusalem. By sunset, the crowds had grown even larger than the previous day. People from all walks of life, local residents, international pilgrims, curious tourists, and skeptical journalists found themselves drawn to the sacred sites as if pulled by an invisible current. Michael Stein, a geology professor from Tel Aviv University, had set up specialized equipment on the Mount of Olives to monitor the unusual seismic patterns. "There's definitely activity here," he confirmed, "but it's unlike any earthquake sequence I've ever studied. It's almost as if—" He hesitated, reluctant to step beyond scientific language. "As if what?" pressed a reporter. "As if the mountain is preparing for something." Even the birds above the mount circled and vanished as darkness fell completely. At precisely midnight, a new phenomenon began. Witnesses at the Garden of Gethsemane first noticed it. a subtle illumination emanating from within the ancient olive trees themselves, a soft, pulsing glow that seemed to follow the rhythm of the tremors that had been occurring since the previous morning. Cameras captured the scene as the illumination spread tree by tree up the slopes of the Mount of Olives. Social media exploded with live videos, though many reported their phones overheating or batteries draining inexplicably fast. "The prophet spoke of a day when light would return to Zion," whispered an elderly man as he watched the trees begin to glow. By 2 a.m., international news networks had interrupted regular programming to broadcast live from Jerusalem. The illuminated olive trees created a map of light across the mountain's surface, visible from miles away. Satellite images showed Jerusalem as a bright spot against the darkness of the surrounding landscape. Some claimed to hear sounds, not physical noise, but something felt more than heard, a deep resonance that seemed to vibrate at the very threshold of human perception. Rabbi David Levi addressed a group gathered at the Western Wall. "In the book of Joel it is written, 'I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth.' And in the Gospel of Luke, 'There will be signs in the sun, moon, and stars.'" As 3 a.m. approached, 33 minutes from the exact time when the phenomena had begun the previous day, a hushed anticipation fell over the entire city. The trembling beneath the surface intensified, still gentle but unmistakably stronger than before. Dr. Sarah Cohen, monitoring instruments near the Temple Mount, called her colleague on the Mount of Olives. "Michael, are you seeing this? The pattern is changing. It's becoming more—" Her voice trailed off as she stared at her screen. "More coherent," Michael finished her thought. "It's as if the random tremors are aligning into a single, coordinated movement." At 3:30 a.m., a cloud formation appeared above the illuminated Mount of Olives, unusual in the clear night sky. Those watching described it as silvery white, almost luminous against the darkness, and it seemed to descend slowly toward the mountaintop. "Maybe it's not hidden," said a young woman as she looked up at the cloud. "Maybe it's revealed only to those meant to see." At precisely 3:33 a.m., witnesses reported seeing what appeared to be a fissure of light, a vertical line that ran from the summit of the Mount of Olives downward, oriented exactly east to west. It lasted only moments, but in that brief time, those present felt something that transcended physical sensation, a recognition, a remembering of something ancient yet immediate. A pilgrim whispered Joel's prophecy, her voice breaking, "And it shall come to pass afterward, that I will pour out my spirit on all flesh." By dawn, the illumination had faded from the olive trees, and the cloud had dispersed. But something had changed, not just in the physical landscape, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed the night's events. Mainstream scientists offered explanations ranging from unusual atmospheric electricity to mass suggestion, while religious leaders from various traditions spoke of signs and wonders. But those who had been present knew something the cameras hadn't fully captured, something that analyses couldn't quantify, a moment when the veil between seen and unseen had grown thin, when ancient prophecy and present experience had aligned like stars in a long-awaited constellation. As the sun rose over Jerusalem, casting long shadows from the Mount of Olives across the Kidron Valley, many wondered, what would the third night bring? Something is happening right now in Jerusalem. By the third day, Jerusalem had become the focus of global attention. Religious pilgrims flooded into the city from around the world. Scientists established monitoring stations at key locations, and media outlets maintained continuous live coverage. The Israeli authorities had established crowd control measures, but they were struggling to manage the sheer number of people drawn to the city. The lamps reflected on wet cobblestones as an unexpected rain, brief but intense, swept through Jerusalem in the late afternoon. Many saw it as a purification, a cleansing before whatever might come next. The air felt charged, as if the very atmosphere was holding its breath. Dr. Michael Stein hadn't slept in nearly 48 hours. His equipment on the Mount of Olives had detected steadily intensifying vibrations beneath the surface, still imperceptible to most humans, but following a clear pattern of escalation. "If this continues at the current rate," he told his colleagues, "we might see actual geological movement tonight." Even the wind between the domes fell silent as evening approached. By midnight, the slopes of the Mount of Olives were covered with thousands of people, keeping a respectful distance from the scientific equipment, but filling every available space. The Israeli military had established a security perimeter, though there had been no unrest. Despite the diverse faiths and nationalities represented in the crowd, a remarkable sense of reverence prevailed. At 1:17 a.m., the first visible sign appeared, a narrow crack in the ground near the summit of the mount, running precisely east to west. It was small, just centimeters wide, but perfectly straight. Dr. Stein's instruments recorded it immediately. "This isn't normal fault behavior," he said, studying the data with growing amazement. "Natural faults don't form in perfect lines like this." By 2 a.m., the crack had widened to nearly half a meter and had extended in both directions. Those with a clear view could see a soft blue luminescence emanating from deep within the fissure, a light unlike anything that could be explained by known geological phenomena. An old merchant said, "I've waited my whole life for this." News helicopters circled overhead, their cameras zooming in on the growing divide. Social media platforms struggled to handle the volume of live streams being broadcast from the scene. Major religious leaders issued statements, many calling for prayer and contemplation of sacred texts that had foretold signs in Jerusalem. At 3 a.m., a sound began, not loud but deep and resonant, like the sustained note of an immense instrument playing at the edge of audibility. Those present described feeling it in their bones, more than hearing it with their ears. "It's like the mountain is singing," whispered a young woman, tears streaming down her face. Then, at precisely 3:33 a.m., the event that would be replayed on screens around the world for years to come. The fissure suddenly widened with astonishing speed, not violently, but with what witnesses described as purposeful movement. The ground shifted, the crack expanded to several meters wide, and continued to grow. The Mount of Olives was splitting in two, just as Zechariah had described thousands of years before. A rabbi whispered Zechariah's words as the mountain continued its transformation. "On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley." Within minutes, the narrow fissure had become a valley several meters wide, extending from one side of the mount to the other. Instruments registered the movement, but remarkably, there was no destructive earthquake, no collapse of buildings or infrastructure. It was as if the mountain was being carefully, precisely divided by an unseen hand. Those nearest to the edge of the newly formed valley reported seeing not emptiness below, but a path, smooth and lined with what appeared to be the same blue luminescence that had first appeared within the crack. By dawn, the transformation had stabilized. Where once there had been a single Mount of Olives, there was now a clear division, two elevated sections with a perfectly straight valley between them, running precisely east to west. Scientists were at a loss to explain what they had witnessed. "This defies everything we understand about geological processes," Dr. Stein admitted to reporters. "The precision, the timing, the lack of collateral effects, it's beyond our current scientific framework." As morning light spread across Jerusalem, illuminating the transformed landscape, people of faith from traditions around the world saw something the cameras couldn't fully capture: the fulfillment of ancient words, the alignment of prophecy and present reality, the tangible evidence that perhaps the veil between worlds was thinner than most had dared to believe. We all felt it, even those who doubted. A recognition that we were standing at a threshold, witnessing the beginning of something that transcended ordinary understanding. What happened in Jerusalem that night stopped a city, but what was coming would touch the world. Jerusalem stopped this morning for a reason no one can explain. 1 week had passed since the Mount of Olives had split, forming a valley that ran precisely east to west. The international response had been unprecedented. Religious pilgrimages increased 1,000-fold. Scientific expeditions arrived daily to study the phenomenon, and world leaders issued statements ranging from calls for calm to declarations of spiritual significance. The city glowed violet as the prayers echoed into the twilight. Thousands gathered daily at the newly formed valley, many walking its length in reverent silence. The smooth path between the divided halves of the mountain had become a place of pilgrimage for people from every faith tradition. For a moment, even the birds above the mount circled and vanished. Dr. Sarah Cohen had been analyzing samples from the valley floor since its formation. The material isn't volcanic, sedimentary, or metamorphic, she explained to colleagues at an emergency geological conference hastily organized in Jerusalem. It doesn't match any known stone type on Earth. The blue luminescence continued to emanate from the valley at night, visible from miles away. It required no power source and seemed unaffected by weather conditions. Spectrographic analysis had proven inconclusive. The light operated at frequencies that existing scientific instruments struggled to categorize. Perhaps most remarkable was what many called the valley effect. Those who walked the path between the divided mountain reported experiences that defied rational explanation: profound peace, emotional healing, sudden insights, and in some cases, physical restoration. Medical researchers documented cases of chronic conditions improving after time spent in the valley. Neuroscientists recorded unusual brainwave patterns in subjects who had walked the path. Something was happening at the intersection of physical place and human experience that challenged conventional understanding. A woman next to me began to cry. She said she'd seen this before, in a dream. By the seventh evening, as the sun set over Jerusalem, casting long shadows through the new valley, a different kind of gathering had formed. Not the chaotic crowds of the first days, but a more intentional assembly. Representatives from diverse faith traditions, scientists, local residents, and visitors who had been drawn to Jerusalem from around the world. Together, they formed a continuous line through the valley, holding hands in what was being called the chain of witness. Jewish rabbis stood alongside Christian priests, Muslim imams next to Buddhist monks, secular scientists beside indigenous spiritual leaders, all united in the recognition that they were in the presence of something that transcended their individual frameworks of understanding. Someone remembered Joel's prophecy, and the crowd went silent. "I will pour out my spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions." As darkness fell completely and the blue light from the valley floor illuminated the faces of those gathered, a collective realization seemed to spread through the assembly, not through words, but through a shared perception that moved from person to person like a wave. We were not simply witnessing a geological event or even the fulfillment of a single prophecy. We were standing at the beginning of a new chapter in human understanding, a time when the boundaries between the seen and unseen worlds were being redrawn. A pilgrim whispered, "The heavens just touched the earth." Scientists continued their measurements, religious leaders their interpretations, media their coverage. But beneath these responses was a growing recognition that what had happened in Jerusalem was just the beginning. The splitting of the Mount of Olives, precise, purposeful, and peaceful, pointed towards something greater still to come. It was both fulfillment and prelude, conclusion and introduction. As the seventh night deepened and stars appeared above the divided mountain, those gathered in the luminous valley looked upward with a shared question: what comes next? The next sign will come at night. Be ready. For those who had eyes to see and hearts to understand, the message was clear. The ancient words of prophets had taken physical form in Jerusalem, not as destruction or ending, but as invitation and beginning. They said it ended tonight, but dawn hasn't come yet. What happened that week in Jerusalem stopped a city, but what was coming would awaken the world.